Hello, friends. Welcome back to You're Listening to Radio Revel and the Fictional Interlude series. Today I'm reading the first installment of the last of the stories from the collection titled 3. This story called The City of Towers. I've mentioned a bit of the origin of this story. The main character is someone I met when I lived in New York City, an older woman named Madeline who was a painter. We met when we worked together on costumes for a production of Four Saints in 3 Acts put on by the Brooklyn Academy of Music back in the late 80s. That was a production where I actually met the composer, Virgil Thompson, though he probably didn't realize he was meeting me. He was pretty well into advanced old age when they presented him to the cast and crew of the show. The main event of this story is also based upon a historical event I lived in nearly first person. My then mate Stephen was running costumes for the long-run production of O Calcutta at the Roosevelt Theater. He came home from the show very late one evening and told me the horrifying event that I've fictionalized a bit in this story, so there's quite a bit of real-life drama in this one. I hope you enjoy this first part of the 2-part reading of The City of Towers. Madeline was born around the turn of the century, at a time when many of the towers were just being constructed. She could yet remember days when her governess walked with her on the outskirts of the park. They pointed out the towering edifices to one another as they became the horizon, blocking the true horizon, giving the earth an uneven set of dark-colored teeth. "How many people will live in that one?" Madeline would ask. Pilar, her nanny, would make some quick calculations, which she had become quite good at since the missus had given her responsibility for the household accounts some 2 or 3 years earlier. Then she would say some massive number like 3,000 or 7,000 or sometimes 12,436. Madeline would react wide-eyed with awe, sometimes gasping with her little hand over her mouth, and "oh my" popping out against her will. Madeline thought she recalled watching the streets fill each day with more people as the many flats, once empty sky, became occupied. She was even sure that at the age of 5 she had made the connection between the growing crowds in the streets and the filling buildings. However, she could not make any clear mental image of how those 3,000 or 7,000 or 12,436 managed to carry out their lives. Madeline herself lived in a 3-story private house on the east side of the park, with gardens all around, a room of her own, a room for her clothing, a room for her dolls and toys and lessons. She began to understand that day Pilar took her to the small animal zoo in the park to visit the ant farm. There was a dim room at the end of a long hall lined with glassed cages of snakes and bugs and mice and such. Within this room of solely glass walls was the colony of leaf-eating ants. Although later on Madeline had visited several of the towers, she clung to the childish belief that the people living within a tower somehow entered through the roof carrying bags of chewed-up banana leaves to deliver to the landlord, a fat woman with a grotesquely huge rear end. This woman lived in the deepest, darkest room of the building. Now Madeline realized this wasn't so by the age of 7, but when comparing her fantasy image with Pilar's carefully explained reality, Madeline chose the imaginative one and stuck by that choice throughout her long life. Madeline had just been born when Pilar became a part of the family. Pilar was 21 years old, had lived in a small Spanish coastal city all of her life, had answered an advertisement for a nanny, went for the interview at the hotel where wealthy tourists stayed and locals only cleaned or cooked. She had asked at the concierge for the Macintoshes and had been told to wait in the lounge. They would be down directly. She found herself in a place she had never imagined existed, was timidly impressed by the dark setting, the comfortable chairs, the huge crystal ashtray in the center of the low marble-topped table. Pilar sat hunched within the cushions of the chair for several minutes, hoping that no one would approach and ask her what she wanted to drink. She did not drink. Her mother was religiously against alcohol. Her father drank too much. Pilar always found herself in the middle, loving her mother for her purity, hating her for the way she treated her father, loving her father for his good humor, for he was a good-humored drunk, hating him for his rebellion against her mother and the tension it brought to their home. Just as the waiter approached, just as she was holding her breath, hoping it would help her think of something to say, Mr. and Mrs. McIntosh entered. They asked her if she wanted anything to drink. She said she would like some mineral water. Mrs. McIntosh had a tonic, Mr. McIntosh an orange juice. Mrs. McIntosh, Margaret née Keenly, spoke none of Pilar's native tongue, while Mr. McIntosh, Albert, spoke quite well, though haltingly. She was a large, handsome woman of 29 or 30 years who hardly appeared to have recently carried a child for 9 months. Particularly fond of playing at golf, 3 trophies sat upon her mantelpiece, and bowling, she was always in the best of health. He was a big, dark-complexioned man who did a good deal of business between his native land and that of Pilar. For this reason he was able to communicate to Pilar what they wished and what she would receive in return. What they wished initially during the first years of their daughter's life was a governess, a nanny to look after the child, to free her mother of basic responsibilities so as to be able to devote herself exclusively to the love of the child. In subsequent years, as the child began to learn to be responsible for herself, the governess would take on more general household responsibilities. Somewhere in the midst of this job description, the tragic fact was revealed that Madeline had been one of 2. Twins had been born. But Madeline's umbilical cord had made a neat loop around Margaret's neck, strangling her before the delivery took place. Relating this to Madeline would not occur, it was made clear, until she had reached an age of reason, and that the responsibility for telling her was not to be Pilar's, but rather Mr. McIntosh's. Pilar nodded her understanding, even as she admired how courageous the couple across from her must have been in discussing such a personal matter with a total stranger. But Pilar was to become a member of the family. She would have to learn to speak the McIntosh's tongue, for example, and there were to be no secrets among them, though private affairs must remain private. With tears in her eyes, Pilar's mother hugged her youngest daughter as if she knew her own death would come before Pilar had had her first opportunity to visit home. The heart yearning for the baby who now traveled to live across the sea, the hard village life, and a stroke, led Pilar's mother peacefully to the other side in only one day. Only one day earlier she had been almost cheerfully cutting up tomatoes to preserve in jars. Only one day later she lay quietly on her bier, candles surrounding her, dripping trails of wax upon the floor that only one day earlier she had been scrubbing. Pilar awoke from a dream in which her mother and she were strolling among clusters of tall buildings, commenting on their population. Pilar explained to Madeline why her eyes were red from the weeping, even though Madeline could not yet speak, could not communicate. Pilar knew Madeline knew what was said within the telegram she had received only today. The McIntoshes said they would gladly pay Pilar's passage home for the funeral, but Pilar would hear nothing of it. She saw no reason to attend to the shell that had once been the mother of 5. No, her mother was with her now, lived in her life, was closer to Pilar than she had ever been. Besides, who would care for Madeline during her absence? Pilar recognized the intensity of her mother's farewell the day they parted, and found solace in being occupied as she was with Madeline. So, as the years passed, Madeline developed a strange type of personality that she didn't allow tampering with by those she chose to have around her. Even before she was of school age or had playmates her own age, her parents, and especially Pilar, were to recognize when they were allowed into her world and when she intended to simply ignore their existence. Madeline had experimented briefly with violent temper tantrums, lying face down on the floor and beating her head against the polished boards. A deep maroon color they were, the color her face would take on when she refused to breathe. Madeline shortly abandoned these dramatic demonstrations of emotional tenacity, firstly because they always gave her headaches, secondly because Pilar had told her that she would someday cave her forehead in and thus grow into a remarkably ugly young lady. Pilar had shown her a picture of a Frenchman whose forehead had been caved in by a falling tree, and Madeline sometimes had nightmares of him chasing her among the towers that now surrounded all sides of the park, casting long, ugly, sinister shadows among the trees and benches and strollers. What finally led Madeline to turning her back on the tantrums was that one day she noticed that no one was paying her any attention. She decided that this was the grown-ups' mistake. They had just illustrated to her the power of ignoring. She chose to use silence. She refused to recognize her mother, to listen to or understand her father, to mind Pilar to the point of eliciting tears of frustration. Madeline didn't have to use this new tool very often, never used it to get her way, only used it when she did not want to be bothered. In this way she could be left alone for hours, lost in her own thoughts, most likely staining her fingers with paint. Madeline's parents' death came as quite a surprise, not only because of its suddenness, but also because of the event itself. Madeline, then 16, was away for the weekend, visiting friends of the family who had a house in the country. She particularly loved visiting these friends because the house, and especially the grounds and gardens and the pond in the back, offered her so many models, so patient to sit for her as she dabbed at a canvas with a brush dipped delicately into blue or green or rose or violet. This weekend was like so many others she had spent here, hours lost in capturing and changing the images she focused on during the daylight hours. The time usually flew, but this time differed in that the mistress of the house was in bed, quite ill, having the most incredible hallucinations. At times in the night, Madeline would awaken from a nightmare to realize that the screams in her dream were the screams of her hostess. Madeline was quite disturbed by it all, the cries of visions of death, death of the mother, death of the father, death of the child. She begged leave early and took the first train home Sunday morning. Albert had been behaving oddly for several weeks, almost 3 months actually, sulking about the house and the office, barely attending to his business. Margaret had been nervous, though satisfied in a way Madeline could not put her finger on. Her mother and father appeared to have stopped talking to one another, did the most basic communication through their daughter or Pilar or one of the other household staff. When Madeline arrived home at about 4 that Sunday afternoon, she was not alarmed to find the house quiet. Pilar was vacationing at the beach. The rest of the help were off on Sundays. She expected her parents were out for a drive, together or separately, and as she was tired, she went straight to her room, straight to bed, exhausted from 3 successive sleepless nights. As she slept, she had a strange dream. She was visiting an old friend with whom she had had a falling out. The two of them had not seen one another for years, and each was glad to see the other and to attempt to forget, or at least ignore, whatever had passed between them that had kept them apart. Madeline marveled at her friend's flat, how open, how spacious, how well lit it was. They went out onto the terrace together and looked across the vista afforded from the top of one of the highest towers in the city. Madeline looked down to the street below. She saw a crowd of people gathered, looking like a closed flower, leaning over something that lay on the sidewalk. The group opened its petals, and Madeline saw and recognized the man lying mutilated, but didn't know who he was. As she went down to the street, she found herself carrying huge and heavy bales of banana leaves down a long stairway until she entered the deepest cellar of the building, and there found her mother sitting in the throne, chewing on leaves, smiling grotesquely as her mouth bled copiously. Madeline awoke quite suddenly, her eyes focusing on the blind she had pulled over the window. There was yet light at the edges. She couldn't have slept more than an hour. She could smell or taste or feel something in the air, but it resisted materializing, something that she felt lurking in the corners of her mind, waiting to be discovered. She rose and went to her mother's room. Mr. McIntosh had hired a private investigator to tail his wife during the day. Though he was never able to say why, Albert suspected that Margaret was having an affair. He waited patiently in his office, Friday afternoon, to hear a complete report, to see evidence either of his beliefs in his wife's infidelity or his foolishness in believing such to be possible. He smoked a cigarette and did nothing more than stare at the ceiling for over an hour. Finally, the private detective made his appearance. Albert McIntosh told the help they might take both Saturday and Sunday off. Madeline was out of the city, and he and his wife planned to spend the weekend in the country. Margaret got home shortly after 9 o'clock Friday night, just after Albert had finished writing the third note. She greeted him with an icy peck on the forehead that pierced his heart. She said she was going to bed. Was he coming? In a moment, he assured her. She went to bed. He went to the kitchen, and, opening a drawer, found the largest knife they had, the one with which the cook sliced large beef cuts to convert them into manageable pieces. Albert stabbed his wife 25 times and left her as she soaked the mattress with blood and urine. He went to the garage, got in his auto, and drove to his office, took the elevator to the uppermost floor, the 16th, climbed out onto the roof, stood on the edge that gave onto the inner service courtyard, removed his shirt and tied it about his eyes, and jumped. Madeline found one of the notes leaning against the mirror in her parents' bathroom as she splashed her pale face with cold water, spitting bile out of her mouth. The ink line that spelled out her name on the envelope was blotchy from the drops that had ricocheted from her fingers. Before reading it, she tried to think what to do, decided she should telephone someone, didn't know who to telephone, but went downstairs to the phone anyway. Before leaving her mother alone again, she pulled a sheet over her mutilated body and found a second note on the pillow by her mother's head. This one was in an envelope marked Margaret. She found the third note on the table downstairs next to the telephone. The envelope had no name. She laid the other two notes next to the third, lifted the receiver, asked the operator to connect her with the police. While waiting on the line, she wondered to herself what it was she should say. Hello, I've found my mother stabbed to death in her bed. My father is not at home. Can you come right away? She herself did not believe there was any conviction in the sentence. Should she make it more believable by weeping hysterically, seeming incoherent? But she did not feel either incoherent or like weeping. In later years, she would convince herself that it had merely been quite naturally a bad case of shock. At the time, though, she only felt ill to her stomach, as if something she had eaten had settled badly. While waiting for the police to arrive, she sat in her father's writing room with the 3 envelopes on her lap, yet unopened, trying to decide which to read first and which to read last, leaving the one in the middle for the other 2 to decide. She finally chose to read them in the order she had found them: Madeline, Margaret, the blank one. The note addressed to her went,
My dearest Madeline, I don't know if you are of an age to understand just what I have done today, this evening. I expect you are, though your mysterious silences have hardly ever given me a clue as to what goes on in your head. I expect that much of what I did has been kept from you. No doubt Pilar will try to protect you from the more grisly parts. Yet somehow I feel that you will be the one who discovers what has happened, and hope you won't be, as these modern psychologists say, permanently scarred. I do not intend herein to explain myself to you, for in the end it's really not any business of the child what goes on between the parents. I believe our lives are separate and private, you know that. Nor do I intend to give you wise words of advice by which you may live your life until you find your own way. I actually believe you have already found your own way. There is one matter that I wish to clear up with you. Only Pilar knows of it, and she was instructed long ago to keep this information to herself.
So it was that Madeline found out that she had had a twin sister. She suddenly decided to read the unmarked envelope rather than the one meant for her now-dead mother, who would never know its contents. The third note was merely some brief words to the police and the lawyer, to the former an admission of his actions, to the latter a few instructions, code-like, as if the two, the lawyer and the father, had discussed this possible violent outcome. The police, after seeing this note, questioned the lawyer closely on his knowledge of the event, but nothing ever came of it. It was simply their only way of coming to an understanding of what had happened over that weekend. They never saw the other two notes. Madeline locked them away among other papers she had in a strongbox, under her shoes in the closet, papers filled with strange poetry and songs she was sometimes moved to write. She didn't even read the note to her mother herself, though she was to hear those words several decades later. That's it for part one. How's that for a bit of off-Broadway drama? We were all pretty much shocked by the event, the murder-suicide, when it happened. The man who did the deed was the producer of the show, O Calcutta, and not long after he'd killed himself, that stalwart of off-Broadway was closed down. A pity. It was a bit of New York theater history I was able to enjoy in real time. So, hope you'll be back next week for the final part of The City of Towers. Same place, same time, here on You're Listening to Radio Revel. Cheers!
You're listening to Radio Revel. Listen, like, subscribe, and share.